In the spring of 1865, the United States declared slavery over. The Civil War had ended, and with it came the promise of freedom for millions of formerly enslaved black men, women, and children. Church bells rang, newspapers printed bold headlines, and a nation told itself a powerful story that justice had finally arrived. For many, freedom felt real, but fragile. Families stepped off plantations for the first time. People searched for loved ones sold away years earlier. Formerly enslaved men walked public roads without permission, believing a new life had begun. But freedom did not last. Within weeks, southern towns began to change. Local jails quietly filled with black men, not accused of serious crimes, but arrested for standing in the wrong place, for not carrying proof of employment, for violating newly written local rules that had not existed before. The same system that had once controlled black bodies through chains was rebuilding itself through law. What followed was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate response to freedom itself. This story is not only about the past. It is about how systems adapt when they are threatened, and how power survives by changing its appearance. To understand what happened after slavery officially ended is to understand how forced labor continued. Legally, in the United States for decades, in this documentary, we will uncover how freedom was undone, how the law became a weapon, and how millions were pulled back into bondage under a new name. If you value honest history and stories that are rarely told in classrooms or textbooks, take a moment to support this channel. Like this video, subscribe for more in-depth documentaries, and join us as we uncover the hidden chapters of American history that still shape the world today. When slavery officially ended, the United States stood at a crossroads it had never faced before. Freedom was no longer an abstract ideal debated in speeches and courtrooms. It was a living reality affecting millions of people overnight. For formerly enslaved black Americans, emancipation carried a profound sense of possibility. Many believed that freedom would bring land, wages, education, and the right to shape their own futures. Families reunited when they could. Communities formed schools and churches with astonishing speed. For the first time, black voices entered public life openly. Voting, organizing, and imagining citizenship as something real rather than distant. Yet this fragile moment of transformation unfolded in a nation deeply unprepared to accept it. The Southern economy had been built almost entirely on forced labor, and emancipation threatened not only wealth but identity and power. Former slaveholders did not simply lose workers, they lost control. And control, more than labor, had always been the foundation of the system. As Reconstruction began, federal laws promised protection, but enforcement was inconsistent and often temporary. Union troops were present in some areas, absent in others. Courts struggled to define what freedom actually meant in daily life. In this uncertainty, Southern lawmakers moved quickly, reshaping the legal landscape before freedom could take root. They did not openly challenge emancipation. Instead, they redefined it. Freedom, they argued, required discipline. Order required law. And law, they claimed, required punishment. New regulations appeared almost overnight, governing how black people could work, move, and exist in public spaces. These laws were framed as neutral, but they were anything but. They narrowed the space of freedom until it became nearly unlivable. A man without a job could be arrested, even when employers refused to hire him. Leaving a workplace could be treated as a criminal act. Everyday survival became legally risky. What made this betrayal especially powerful was its appearance of legitimacy. The same nation that had declared slavery immoral now insisted that punishment was lawful, even necessary. Freedom remained intact in language, but in practice it became conditional, fragile, and easily revoked. Emancipation was not destroyed in a single moment. it was slowly undermined through rules that transformed ordinary life into potential criminal behavior. By the time the promise of freedom began to fade, a new system was already taking shape, one that looked nothing like slavery on the surface, but reproduced its outcomes with remarkable efficiency. The betrayal was not loud or dramatic. It was administrative, procedural, and quietly devastating. As the promise of emancipation narrowed, the machinery that would replace slavery began to reveal itself. It did not arrive with whips or chains, but with legal language, stamped documents, and quiet decisions made in courthouses across the South. These laws, later known as the Black Codes, were presented as tools of order in a region struggling to rebuild. In reality, they were designed to define freedom so narrowly that it became almost impossible to live within it. The Black Codes turned everyday life into a legal risk. Movement, work, speech, and even presence in public spaces were regulated in ways that applied almost exclusively to Black Americans. Freedom existed, but only under conditions set by those who had once owned it. A man who could not prove steady employment could be arrested for vagrancy, even when economic systems denied him opportunity. Leaving a job, questioning unfair treatment, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to detention. What had once been enforced through direct ownership was now enforced through paperwork and patrols. Courts played a central role in this transformation. Trials were brief, often perfunctory, and rarely offered meaningful defense. Fines were imposed that most could not pay, and failure to do so carried consequences far more severe than the original charge. The law functioned less as a system of justice and more as a gateway, moving people from freedom into confinement with remarkable efficiency. In this process, crime itself was redefined. It was no longer primarily about harm or intent, but about compliance with a social order that freedom had supposedly ended. What made the Black Codes so effective was their appearance of neutrality. On the surface, they spoke the language of responsibility and public safety. In practice, they ensured that large numbers of Black men and women would remain under constant threat of arrest. This threat shaped behavior, limited mobility, and reinforced dependence on exploitative labor arrangements. Freedom became conditional, monitored, and easily withdrawn. The transformation was subtle but profound. Slavery had once been justified openly as an economic necessity. Now control was justified as law enforcement. The Black Codes did not erase emancipation, but they hollowed it out, creating a legal environment in which freedom existed more as a theory than a lived reality. By criminalizing ordinary existence, these laws laid the groundwork for a system that would soon expand beyond the courtroom, reaching into prisons, labor camps, and the broader economy, all while claiming to operate within the boundaries of legality and order. Once the Black Codes had done their work, the next stage unfolded with unsettling efficiency. Courthouses fed jails, and jails fed an emerging marketplace where punishment became profit. States across the South faced a problem of their own making. Prisons filled rapidly, and governments lacked the resources or the desire to care for those they had confined. The solution they embraced was not rehabilitation, but outsourcing. Convict leasing transformed incarceration into a business arrangement. State officials signed contracts with private companies eager for labor, railroads expanding across the South, mines digging deep into the earth, and agricultural enterprises rebuilding after the war all needed workers. Through leasing agreements, prisoners were transferred from state custody into the hands of these businesses. Not as employees but as leased labor, payment flowed to the state, while responsibility for the people themselves effectively vanished. For those caught in this system, the transition was abrupt and final. A sentence handed down in a small courtroom could result in transport to a remote labor camp hundreds of miles away. Communication with family disappeared. Legal oversight faded. What remained was work defined by exhaustion and discipline enforced by threat. The line between punishment and production blurred until it no longer existed. This system thrived because it satisfied multiple interests at once. Governments generated revenue without building or maintaining prisons. Businesses acquired a workforce that could not negotiate wages, hours, or conditions. And the broader society was reassured that order was being maintained. All of it operated under the authority of the law, shielded from moral scrutiny by legal contracts and official language. Race shaped every aspect of this arrangement. Although the laws were written in general terms, those swept into leasing camps were overwhelmingly black. Many convicted of minor offenses or technical violations created by the black codes themselves. The narrative of criminality, already taking root, now gained apparent evidence in the form of prison labor statistics, reinforcing the idea that incarceration was a natural outcome rather than a manufactured one. What emerged was not chaos, but an organized system built on predictability and supply. Arrests produced prisoners, prisoners produced labor, labor produced profit. In this cycle, human beings were reduced to units of output, measured not by their lives or futures, but by their capacity to work until they could no longer continue. Slavery had not returned by name, but its economic logic had found a new, legally protected form, embedding itself deeply within the structures of post-war recovery and ensuring that freedom, for many, remained permanently out of reach. As convict leasing expanded, its true nature became impossible to ignore for those trapped inside it. Many who endured the system would later say that what they experienced felt even harsher than slavery, a comparison that at first seemed unthinkable. Slavery had been openly brutal, but it had also been governed by ownership. Enslaved people were treated as property, and in that twisted logic, their survival carried monetary value. Under convict leasing, that calculation disappeared entirely. Once a person was leased, their life was no longer tied to long-term profit. Companies did not purchase human beings. They rented them. When a body was exhausted, injured, or unable to work, it could be replaced with another leased prisoner. This reality shaped daily life in labor camps, where the pace of work was relentless and concern for well-being was minimal. The system rewarded output, not endurance, and suffering became an accepted cost of doing business. Men labored for endless hours in mines, forests, and fields, often under conditions that pushed the limits of human strength. Injuries were common and rarely treated. Illness spread easily through overcrowded camps where food and shelter were inadequate. For those who collapsed, there was no safety net, no expectation of recovery, and no guarantee that anyone beyond the camp even knew they were gone. Families waited without answers, unsure whether their loved ones were alive or dead. What made this system especially devastating was its invisibility. Unlike plantation slavery, which was a public institution embedded in everyday life, convict leasing operated out of sight, in remote locations far from scrutiny. Oversight existed mostly on paper. State inspections, when they occurred at all, were brief and superficial. Complaints from prisoners carried no weight against contracts and revenue streams. The cruelty of convict leasing was not accidental. It was the predictable result of a system designed around disposability. Where slavery had relied on long-term control, leasing relied on short-term extraction. The human cost was absorbed quietly, recorded only in mortality statistics and unmarked graves. In this environment, survival was uncertain, and dignity was treated as irrelevant. By the late 19th century, reports began to surface describing conditions so severe that even some supporters of the system were forced to confront its consequences. Yet the machinery continued to operate, driven by profit and protected by law. Convict leasing did not merely replicate the violence of slavery. It refined it, stripping away any remaining obligation to preserve life and revealing a system in which human suffering was not a failure, but a feature. For convict leasing to survive, it needed more than laws and contracts. It required a story, one that could explain why so many black men were being arrested, confined, and sent into forced labor, while allowing the nation to see this outcome as natural rather than engineered. That story became the myth of black criminality, a narrative carefully built and widely circulated in the years following emancipation. As prisons filled, statistics were presented without context, stripped of the laws that had produced them. Arrest numbers were offered as proof of inherent wrongdoing rather than evidence of selective enforcement. Newspapers described black communities through the language of disorder, while ignoring the conditions that made ordinary life increasingly criminalized. Images of men in prison uniforms were circulated as symbols, reinforcing the idea that confinement was a reflection of character rather than circumstance. This myth did not emerge spontaneously. It was cultivated through speeches, headlines, and courtroom routines that treated black defendants as predictable subjects of punishment. Judges, sheriffs, and politicians spoke of maintaining order, while quietly benefiting from a system that transformed arrests into revenue. Each conviction seemed to confirm the next, creating a cycle in which criminalization justified itself. The more people were arrested, the more legitimate the system appeared. What made the myth especially powerful was its distance from lived reality. It allowed the public to separate cause from effect, to believe that incarceration explained forced labor rather than the other way around. The role of the black codes faded from view, replaced by the assumption that those caught in leasing camps had chosen their fate. In this way, the law erased its own fingerprints. Over time, the narrative spread beyond the South. It entered national discussions about citizenship, public safety, and morality. The image of the black criminal became a cultural shorthand, shaping how institutions responded to black communities long after convict leasing itself began to decline. Policing, sentencing, and social policy absorbed these assumptions, embedding them deeply within the structure of American life. The tragedy of this myth was not only that it justified suffering, but that it normalized it. By framing punishment as inevitable, it removed urgency from reform and empathy from public debate. Convict leasing could continue precisely because it appeared to confirm what many were prepared to believe. The system did not merely exploit bodies. It reshaped perception, teaching a nation to mistake injustice for order and to confuse the consequences of oppression with evidence of guilt. Despite the power of the system and the narratives that protected it, convict leasing was never uncontested. Resistance existed even in the most restrictive conditions, though it rarely appeared in dramatic or widely recorded forms. For those trapped inside labor camps, survival itself became an act of defiance. Some slowed their pace when they could, others damaged tools, and a few attempted escape despite the risks. These actions were seldom remembered, but they revealed that the system's control was never absolute. Outside the camps, cracks began to form as well. Former prisoners carried stories that contradicted official accounts, describing conditions far removed from the orderly image presented by state authorities. Their testimonies moved quietly at first, shared within communities that already understood the cost of criminalization. Over time, these accounts reached journalists, religious leaders, and reformers who were willing to listen. Investigative reporting played a crucial role in bringing the reality of convict leasing into public view. Journalists traveled to remote camps, documenting overcrowded stockades, untreated illness, and labor conditions that pushed people beyond exhaustion. Their articles challenged the idea that leasing was a benign solution to post-war economic problems. What emerged was a picture of systematic neglect, hidden behind legal contracts and state approval. Public reaction was uneven, but it grew steadily. Reform movements began to question whether a system that produced such suffering could truly be justified as punishment. In some states, scandals erupted when reports revealed death rates that rivaled those of the harshest industrial accidents. Officials who had defended leasing as efficient and necessary were forced to respond. often by promising oversight that rarely materialized. Change came slowly and evenly. Some states experimented with reforms, replacing private leasing with state-controlled labor or chain gangs that were presented as more humane. Others resisted, unwilling to surrender a source of revenue that supported public budgets. It was not moral awakening alone that weakened convict leasing, but sustained exposure combined with political pressure and economic shifts. By the early 20th century, formal leasing contracts began to disappear, though not all at once and not everywhere. When Alabama finally ended the practice in 1928, it did so under scrutiny, acknowledging abuses it had long denied. Yet even as leasing faded, the logic behind it endured. The exposure of convict leasing revealed the system's brutality. But it also demonstrated how easily forced labor could be reshaped rather than eliminated, setting the stage for what would come next. When convict leasing began to fade, it did not leave behind an empty space. The system that had relied on courts, prisons, and labor had proven too useful to simply disappear. Instead, it evolved. The language changed, the structures shifted, but the underlying logic remained firmly in place. Punishment continued to serve economic and social control, even as its most visible forms were rebranded. States that ended leasing contracts turned to other methods of extracting labor from incarcerated populations. Chain gangs replaced private camps, placing prisoners back under direct state supervision while preserving the expectation of constant work. Prison farms and industrial workshops expanded, framed as discipline or rehabilitation rather than exploitation. These new arrangements were presented as reforms, yet they relied on the same legal foundation that had made convict leasing possible in the first place. At the same time, the myth of criminality that had justified leasing continued to shape public policy. Laws governing policing and sentencing grew stricter, particularly in communities already associated with crime by decades of selective enforcement. Arrests increased, sentences lengthened, and prisons expanded. The removal of leasing did not reduce confinement. It normalized it. As the 20th century progressed, incarceration became a central feature of the American justice system. Prisons multiplied, and confinement was increasingly treated as the default response to social problems. Economic inequality, lack of opportunity, and systemic discrimination were reframed as issues of individual behavior. In this narrative, punishment replaced responsibility, and prisons replaced social investment. The consequences of this transition were profound. Entire communities experienced cycles of surveillance and confinement that echoed earlier patterns of control. Families were separated not by auction blocks or leasing contracts, but by sentences and parole restrictions. The distance between past and present narrowed, connected by legal continuity rather than historical coincidence. What emerged was not a break from history, but an extension of it. Mass incarceration did not arise suddenly or independently. It grew from the same soil that had sustained convict leasing. The exception clause that once allowed forced labor as punishment remained embedded in law, quietly shaping modern practices. In this way, the end of convict leasing marked not a conclusion, but a transformation, ensuring that confinement and control would persist under new names, governed by familiar assumptions, and defended by the same claim of legality that had long shielded injustice from scrutiny. As this story comes to an end, it becomes clear that the history of convict leasing is not a closed chapter, neatly contained in the past. It is a reminder of how systems adapt when confronted with change, and how injustice can survive not by resisting the law, but by reshaping it. Slavery did not vanish in a single moment of moral awakening. It was dismantled publicly, then reconstructed quietly, piece by piece, within institutions that claimed legitimacy. What made this transformation so enduring was its subtlety. Chains were no longer visible, but control remained. Violence no longer defined itself openly, but through procedures, contracts, and sentences. The language of ownership gave way to the language of punishment, and in that shift, responsibility was obscured. Forced labor did not need to announce itself as slavery when it could exist as policy. Convict leasing revealed how easily freedom could be narrowed until it lost its meaning. Emancipation promised possibility, but law redefined it as conditional. The black codes criminalized ordinary life. The courts converted vulnerability into conviction. Businesses transformed punishment into profit. And when the system was finally exposed, it did not disappear. It evolved. Each phase left behind ideas and practices that continue to shape the next, carrying the logic of control forward into new eras. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame to the past alone. It is about recognizing patterns that repeat when power goes unquestioned. The story of Convict leasing challenges comforting narratives that injustice ends simply because it is declared illegal. It shows that progress requires more than new laws. It demands vigilance, accountability, and a willingness to confront how deeply systems are embedded. Today, the legacy of this history can still be felt in debates about justice, punishment, and equality. The distance between past and present is shorter than it appears, connected by laws that were never fully rewritten and assumptions that were never fully dismantled. Remembering this history is not an act of dwelling on suffering, but an act of clarity. It allows us to see how freedom can be compromised, and how easily societies can mistake legality for justice. Thank you for spending your time with this story, and for staying until the end. If you believe that understanding history is essential to understanding the present, please consider supporting this channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps make it possible to continue sharing in-depth documentaries that explore the hidden layers of history and the forces that still shape our world today.